Christmas Day, 1984, Madison Square Garden. The New York Knicks are hosting the New Jersey Nets, and one man is putting on a show that grown people who were in that building still talk about today. By halftime, he already has 40 points. 40. Before most players have even broken a sweat, Bernard King has dropped a full game's worth of scoring on his opponents, and he isn't slowing down. When the final buzzer sounds, he has 60 points, making him just the 10th player in the entire history of the National Basketball Association to ever reach that number in a single game. 60 points on the holiday in the brightest arena in the world. That's one face of Bernard King, the scorer, the killer. The man Julius Erving would call the toughest he ever faced. But there's another face. And to see it, you have to rewind a few short years to a cold morning in January of 1980 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Because there was a version of this same man who, by his own account years later, was so far gone he could barely remember the nights he lived through. A man tangled in arrest records, in misdemeanor charges, in a serious accusation that carried the possibility of a 10-year sentence. A man whose own autobiography would describe that stretch of his life with 4 chilling words: the darkest period of my life. So how does one human being hold both of those truths at the same time?
How does the same person score 60 points on Christmas and just a few years earlier find himself fighting not for a title, but for his freedom and his future? That's the investigation. Behind the highlight reels, behind the All-NBA selections and the scoring titles, there is a story of arrests, of addiction he later admitted to, of a knee injury so brutal that no player before him had ever fully returned from it. This is a story about a man who had 2 separate wars to fight. One was for his legacy, the other was for his life. And before Bernard King could ever fight for that legacy, he had to fight for his life first. But to understand how dark the bottom truly was, we have to go back to the cracked outdoor courts of Brooklyn, where a boy learned to disappear into the only thing that ever made sense. Bernard King was born on December 4th, 1956, in Brooklyn, New York. And if you came up in that era, in that part of the city, you already know what kind of world that was. It wasn't soft. It wasn't forgiving. It was concrete and noise and pressure. The kind of place that either swallows a young man whole or forces him to find something, anything, to hold on to. For Bernard, that something was a basketball. He learned the game on the outdoor playground courts of Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. Not in some polished gymnasium with climate control and fresh nets. We're talking about the asphalt, the chain link, the kind of courts where the rims are bent and the competition is relentless, where you earn respect possession by possession or you get sent home. Those Fort Hamilton courts were his training ground, but they were more than that. They were his escape, a place to disappear from everything around him and lose himself in the only thing that gave his life rhythm and meaning. And out there on that hard New York City pavement, the tools started forming. The long arms that would one day let him shoot over taller defenders. The quick, explosive first step. The release so fast that by the time a defender reacted, the ball was already gone. He would grow into a 6'7", 205-pound small forward, and every bit of that frame was built to do one thing better than almost anyone alive: put the ball in the basket. What made him different wasn't just the gift. It was the hunger behind it, the way he attacked. Even as a young man, scoring wasn't just a skill for Bernard King. It was personal, almost like a release valve for everything the streets had handed him. Those courts would carry him out of Brooklyn and straight into the spotlight of college basketball, where his name would become one half of a legend they still talk about in Tennessee. When Bernard King arrived at the University of Tennessee, the basketball program had no idea it was about to enter its golden age. Paired alongside another star named Ernie Grunfeld, King became one half of what fans and sports media of the late 1970s came to call the Ernie and Bernie Show. And it was exactly that, a show, a spectacle. Two scoring talents lighting up arenas, drawing crowds, turning Tennessee men's basketball into appointment viewing across the region. To this day, many who follow that program point back to the Ernie and Bernie era as the golden age of Volunteers basketball. Not a footnote, the peak, the standard, everything else gets measured against. But make no mistake about who the engine was. Bernard King's offensive game in college was already something rare. The same quick release he'd sharpened on those Brooklyn courts now had a national stage, and he used it. He scored in bunches. He scored against bigger players, longer players, players who knew exactly what he wanted to do and still couldn't stop it. The professional scout looking at him didn't have to squint to imagine what he'd become. The blueprint was right there. By the time he was done lighting up college gyms, Bernard King wasn't just a regional legend. He was one of the most coveted young offensive players in the country. A future top 10 draft selection whose scoring profile practically guaranteed a long professional career. That's the version of the story that looks clean from a distance. The playground kid who turned into a college sensation, headed for the riches and fame of the National Basketball Association. But just 1 month after an NBA team made him a top 10 pick, the police would knock, and the headlines would have nothing to do with basketball. In the 1977 NBA draft, the New York Nets selected Bernard King with the 7th overall pick, 7th in the entire country. A young phenom from Brooklyn by way of Tennessee, coming into the league carrying enormous expectations on those long, powerful shoulders. For most young men, that's the moment the dream finally pays off. The handshake, the contract, the future stretched out wide and bright in front of you. And it should have been a clean, triumphant beginning. It wasn't. Because just 1 month after that draft, in July of 1977, Bernard King was arrested. The charge? Burglary. According to public records from the time, he was accused of breaking into a University of Tennessee athletics building to steal a television set. Read that again. A young man who had just been selected 7th overall in a professional draft, a man on the doorstep of real money and real fame, charged over a stolen television. And that's where the investigation has to slow down and ask the uncomfortable question, how? How does someone with that much promise, that much earning power on the way, end up in handcuffs over something so small, so reckless, so beneath everything he'd worked for? This is the first crack in the story, and it tells you something the box scores never could. Whatever was happening inside Bernard King, it was already pulling against him, already setting up a pattern that would haunt the early years of his career. The world saw a top 10 pick, but underneath that, there was a young man who seemed bent, again and again, on getting in his own way. The theme of self-sabotage doesn't announce itself loudly here. It just quietly opens the door. On the court, though, the rookie was a revelation. He was about to rewrite a franchise record book, even as his private life began quietly falling apart. Whatever was going on after the final buzzer, Bernard King made one thing absolutely clear the moment he stepped onto an NBA floor. The scoring was real, and it was overwhelming. In his rookie season with the New Jersey Nets, King poured in 1,909 points. That averaged out to 24.2 points per game. As a rookie, it set a New Jersey Nets franchise record for the most points scored in a single season. A first-year player walking into the toughest league in the world and immediately producing like a seasoned star. Think about the gap between expectation and reality here. Plenty of 7th overall picks come into the league and need time. They sit, they adjust, they learn the speed of the pro game before the numbers come. Bernard King skipped all of that. The pedigree said he'd be good eventually. The production said he was already there. And the way he scored, that's what separated him. It wasn't pretty in the polished textbook sense. It was relentless. He attacked. That quick release from the Brooklyn courts now came at NBA defenders before they could set their feet. And once he got a rhythm going, there was no clean way to take it from him. Watching him work, you got the feeling scoring wasn't just his job. It was personal, almost violent in its intensity. He made putting the ball in the basket look like a man settling a score. So here's the paradox at the heart of these early years. On paper, Bernard King was one of the best young scorers in all of basketball, a franchise record holder before he could legally rent a car without trouble. But off the paper, away from the bright lights and the box scores, he was already a man in trouble, already someone the law had reason to know. But the numbers couldn't hide what was happening after the final buzzer, and in December of 1978, the NYPD would find him in the worst possible place. December 1978, New York City. Somewhere on the streets of the same town where Bernard had become a star, officers from the New York Police Department came upon a parked car. Inside it, asleep, was one of the most gifted young scorers in professional basketball. According to public records from the time, when they searched him, what they found was small, described as less than $10 worth of a controlled substance found on him. He was charged with several misdemeanors. And here's the thing that makes this episode so easy to underestimate. Those charges were later dropped. So on the surface, you could wave it away. No conviction, small amount, case closed. But step back and really look at what that scene was telling you. This wasn't a kingpin. This wasn't some calculated operation. This was a young man with a franchise scoring record to his name, found asleep behind the wheel, alone, with barely anything of value on him except trouble. That's not the picture of a man living large. That's the picture of a man coming apart. And that's the window. Because everything that the headlines treated as separate incidents, the burglary the year before, now this, was starting to look less like bad luck and more like a pattern. The law kept intervening in the life of a man who on the court looked untouchable. Off it, he was anything but. Years later, in his own telling, Bernard would point to this stretch of his life as a time when something deeper had its hands around his throat. The arrests were the symptoms. The disease was something else entirely. What you have to understand about a slide like this is how quietly it happens in plain sight. A star is producing. The numbers are loud. The winds keep the spotlight pointed at the right places. And in the shadows, just outside that spotlight, a man can be unraveling night after night while the world assumes everything's fine because the box score says so. But the National Basketball Association is a business, and businesses notice patterns. A talent like his could put up 24 a night, but talent doesn't make a front office comfortable when the police keep showing up. So the machinery started turning. He was moved, traded, shuffled along, the way leagues quietly move a problem when they're not sure what else to do with it. He was traded, shuffled, sent west, and in Salt Lake City, the trouble would escalate into the most serious accusation of his life. January 1980, Salt Lake City, Utah. This is the moment the story stops being about reckless mistakes and turns into something far more serious. The kind of accusation that can erase a man's freedom entirely. According to public and court records from that time, Bernard King was arrested after a woman accused him of sexual assault. And the stakes could not have been higher. He was facing the possibility of a 10-year sentence. Read that slowly. 10 years. Not a fine, not a suspended slap on the wrist. A decade of his life and the entirety of his career hanging in the balance over a single accusation in a city far from home. Now, this is where we have to be careful, because around this episode there are accounts and versions, and they matter. By his own assertion, recorded in the legal process, Bernard claimed he was so intoxicated at the time that he had no memory of the events in question. To support that claim, he took multiple lie detector tests. That's the version he put forward through the system. A man saying, in effect, that whatever happened, he was so far gone he couldn't recall it. We're not here to retry that case decades later. What we can do is follow the documented record of how it resolved. That June of 1980, King pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of attempted sexual abuse and received a fine and a suspended sentence. The outcome was a fine and a suspended sentence. No 10 years, no prison cell swallowing the prime of his life. But sit with the weight of that for a second. This was as close to the edge as a career and a life can get. Everything, the talent, the franchise records, the dreams that started on those Brooklyn courts, all of it stood one verdict away from vanishing. A young man, barely into his 20s, staring down a decade behind bars in a state he'd been shipped off to. And notice the thread running through his own defense. Not anger, not denial of being in a terrible place. The claim he leaned on was that he had been too far gone to even remember. Whatever else you make of that, it points straight at the thing that had been chasing him through every arrest, every dropped charge, every shadow outside the spotlight. This was the moment everything could have ended. Not just his career, but his freedom. And by his own later account, the real enemy wasn't the headlines. It was the bottle. For years, the public could only guess at what was really happening to Bernard King. They had the arrest reports, they had the dropped charges and the guilty plea, but they didn't have the story from the inside until decades later, when Bernard himself decided to tell it. In his 2017 autobiography, he finally named the thing that had been hunting him through the late 1970s. He wrote about battling alcohol addiction during that stretch of his life, and he described it in words that don't leave much room for interpretation. He called it the darkest period of my life. And the moment you hear that, the whole picture rearranges itself. Suddenly, the burglary, the nights asleep in that car, the catastrophe in Salt Lake City. None of it reads anymore like the story of a man simply being reckless or arrogant or out of control for the fun of it. It reads like the story of a man drowning. A man whose gift was loud enough to fill arenas, while privately, something quieter and far more dangerous was pulling him under, one night at a time. That's the reframe this story demands. It's easy from a distance to look at a string of arrests and write a young athlete off as a bad seed. It's harder and more honest to recognize what addiction does to a person, how it hijacks judgment, how it erases memory, how it turns a man with everything to lose into someone who keeps ending up in the worst possible place. By his own account, that's exactly what was happening. The scandals were the surface. The addiction was the current underneath them all. And then came the turning point. Following his early 1980 arrest, Bernard King did the thing that would ultimately save everything. He spent a month at a rehabilitation center in California. After that, he sought help through Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the hinge of the entire story, not a single dramatic moment, but a quiet decision to get help while there was still something left to save. Because make no mistake, this is the choice that separates the two faces of the man. Without it, there is no Christmas Day explosion years down the road. There is no scoring title, no Hall of Fame, no legend. There's just a cautionary tale and a stack of arrest records. The decision to walk into that center and then into those rooms is the reason the rest of the story even exists. But while he was fighting to save himself, his basketball career had nearly vanished. In Utah, he'd played just 19 games, and the league had all but written him off. While Bernard was fighting the hardest battle of his life off the court, the damage on the court was just as severe.
The 1979 to 1980 season with the Utah Jazz tells the story in cold, undeniable numbers. 19 games. That's it. That's all he played that entire season. And in those 19 games, he averaged 9.3 points per game. Now put that beside who this man had been. As a rookie, he had poured in 24.2 a night and set a franchise scoring record, 24.2. And now, just a couple of seasons later, here he was, a 9-point scorer who could barely stay on the floor. For a player of his gifts, that's not a slump, that's a collapse. That's a career flatlining in real time. And the symmetry of it is almost too perfect to be coincidence. Rock bottom in his life and rock bottom on the court arrived at the same address. The man who couldn't keep himself out of the worst possible places off the floor was now a man who couldn't get on the floor at all. The addiction he later described wasn't just costing him his freedom and his peace, it was eating the very thing that made him special. 19 games is what happens when the problem finally catches up to the talent. You have to imagine how this looked to the rest of the league at the time. Front offices talk, scouts talk, coaches talk, and the word on Bernard King would not have been kind. Here was a former top 10 pick, a former franchise record holder, now tangled in arrest records and barely able to crack double figures. The most logical conclusion in the world was the cruelest one. He was done, finished. A talent wasted, a cautionary tale at 23 years old. Think about that age for a second. 23. Most players that age are just getting started, just beginning to figure out who they're going to be in the league. Bernard King at 23 was a man the National Basketball Association had essentially given up on. A reclamation project nobody was sure was worth reclaiming. That was the verdict hanging over him. Too much trouble. Too much risk, too far gone. What happened next is the part of the story almost no one expected, because the man the league had given up on was about to engineer one of the greatest comebacks of the decade. The man the league had quietly buried got a new address and a new chance with the Golden State Warriors. And what he did with that chance is the kind of turnaround you build legends out of. In the 1980 to 1981 season, the player who had managed only 19 games the year before, the player who had limped to 9.3 points a night, walked back onto an NBA floor and averaged 21.9 points per game. 21.9. Read those two numbers back to back and let the distance between them sink in. From 9 to nearly 22 in a single year. From a man who couldn't stay on the court to a man who couldn't be kept off the scoreboard. That kind of jump doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen on talent alone. Plenty of gifted men have hit the bottom Bernard hit and never climbed back out. What made the difference here wasn't a new jump shot or a fresh set of plays. It was the work he'd done away from the game, the month in that California center, the quiet rooms, the daily decision to stay sober one more day. The recovery off the floor and the recovery on it were the same story told two different ways. The league noticed. At the age of 24, Bernard King was named the NBA's Comeback Player of the Year for that 1980 to 81 season. Think about what that award really meant in his case. For most players, comeback honors point to a healed injury, a return from the bench. For him, it pointed at something far deeper. A man who had clawed his way back from the edge of losing everything, his freedom included, and turned himself back into one of the most dangerous scorers in basketball. He had his life back. Now he wanted his city back, and a blockbuster trade was about to send him home to the brightest stage in basketball, Madison Square Garden. Just before the start of the 1982 to 83 season, the trade went through that would change everything. The New York Knicks acquired Bernard King in exchange for Michael Ray Richardson. And for a kid who had grown up on the outdoor courts of Brooklyn, this wasn't just a transaction. This was coming home. Sit with the poetry of it for a moment.
The boy who had learned the game on cracked asphalt in New York City, who had used those playground rims as an escape from everything around him, was now being handed the keys to the most famous arena in the sport, Madison Square Garden. The Garden. The center of the basketball universe, right in the heart of the town that made him. And the timing could not have been more perfect. Here was a man who had nearly thrown it all away. The arrests, the collapse in Utah, the season that almost ended his career, now given the one stage built to make a legend out of him. A redemption story is good anywhere, but a redemption story playing out in New York, under those lights, in front of that crowd, that's something else entirely.
That's a story the whole sport stops to watch. The Knicks weren't getting a cautionary tale anymore. They were getting a fully rebuilt force, a scorer who had already proven out in Golden State that the gift was not only intact, but sharper than ever. New York didn't yet know exactly what it had on its hands, but the man stepping off that homecoming was no longer the troubled kid the league had written off. He was a survivor with something to prove, on the one floor in America where proving it would mean the most. What happened over the next 2 seasons would turn a recovering addict into one of the most feared scorers the NBA had ever seen, starting with a single history-making road trip through Texas.
January 31st and February 1st, 1984. 2 nights, 2 cities in Texas, and one of the most staggering scoring stretches the league had seen in nearly 2 decades. On the first night in San Antonio, Bernard poured in 50 points. The very next night in Dallas, he did it again, another 50. Back-to-back games, 50 points in each. And that wasn't just a hot couple of nights, that was history. He became the first player since Rick Barry, all the way back in 1967, to score at least 50 points in consecutive games. 17 years had passed since anyone in the entire National Basketball Association had managed that. And the 50 he dropped in Dallas set a single-game scoring record at Reunion Arena. Now, what made him impossible to stop? Because 50 in one night can be a fluke, a defense that fell asleep, a night where every shot drops. 50 across 2 straight nights is something else. That's not luck. That's a man imposing his will. It came down to the things he'd been sharpening since those Brooklyn playgrounds. The footwork that got him to his spots before defenders could react. The release so quick that by the time a hand went up, the ball was already gone. And the relentlessness. That was the part that broke people. Bernard didn't take a possession off. He attacked and attacked and attacked, the way a man does when scoring isn't a job, but something personal, something he needs. That was the psychological edge. Defenders weren't just guarding a great shooter, they were guarding a man who played every trip down the floor like he had a score to settle, like the basket owed him something. You can scheme against talent. It's much harder to scheme against hunger. And if 50 and 50 felt impossible, what he did on Christmas Day later that year would put his name in a club of only 10 players in the entire history of the league. Christmas Day, 1984. We touched the surface of this one at the very start, but now you understand what it really took to get here, the bottom he climbed out of to stand on this stage. So let's walk all the way through it. The opponent that holiday was the New Jersey Nets, and there's a cruel, perfect irony buried in that matchup. The Nets were the franchise that had drafted him 7th overall back in 1977, the team where his troubled NBA story first began, where the early cracks first showed. Now, years later, a rebuilt man stood across from his old beginning and proceeded to bury them. By halftime, Bernard already had 40 points. 40 in 2 quarters. Let that pace register. Most stars would take a full, excellent night to reach 40. He got there before the locker room break, and he kept going. When it was over, he had 60 points. making him just the 10th player in the entire history of the league to reach 60 or more in a single game. 10th. In all the decades of professional basketball, with all the great scorers who'd come through, only 9 men had ever done it before him. And think about who was doing it. Not some untouchable phenom who'd cruised an easy road to greatness. This was a man who, a few short years earlier, had been found at his lowest, written off, considered finished at 23. This was someone who had to fight an addiction he'd later describe in the bleakest possible terms just to keep his career alive. Now, he was dropping 60 on Christmas, on the very franchise where it all started to go wrong. That's the part that gives this number its weight. 60 points is a remarkable feat for anyone. For a man who'd had to rebuild himself piece by piece, it was something close to vindication. Proof in front of a holiday crowd that the comeback hadn't just worked, it had taken him somewhere almost no one in the sport had ever been. That season, he wasn't just a great scorer, he was the best scorer alive, and the numbers were about to make it official. 60 points on Christmas was the headline, but the season around it was the masterpiece. The 1984-85 campaign is when Bernard didn't just play like one of the best scorers in the game. He became the best scorer in it, with the numbers to prove it beyond argument. That year, he led the entire league in scoring at 32.9 points per game. Not a great number, the great number, the highest in all of basketball. Every defense in the sport spent its nights trying to slow him down, and not one of them could keep him from finishing the season on top of the mountain. The scoring title belonged to the man from Fort Hamilton. And this wasn't a single hot year that came out of nowhere. The foundation was already laid. The season before, in 1983-84, he had poured in 2,027 points and earned the first of back-to-back selections to the All-NBA First Team. Read that pairing carefully. 2 straight years on the first team. That's the league office, the coaches, the people who study this game for a living, all agreeing that for that stretch of time, Bernard King was one of the 5 best players alive. Not a hot streak, a reign. But maybe the most telling tribute didn't come from a stat sheet or an award ballot. It came from another legend. Julius Erving, Dr. J himself, one of the most respected men ever to lace them up, said that Bernard King was the toughest player he had ever faced. Sit with that. A man who guarded the best of an entire era, who shared the floor with the greatest names of his generation, pointed to Bernard as the hardest assignment of them all. Think about what that endorsement really means, coming from a peer like that. Erving wasn't talking about a kid with potential. He was talking about a finished, fully realized force, a scorer so relentless that even the icons of the game dreaded the matchup. The man who'd been written off at 23 was now the player other greats measured themselves against. He was at the absolute summit of the sport. And then, on a single play in March of 1985, his right leg gave way, and everything he'd rebuilt threatened to collapse a second time. March 23rd, 1985. It was just another basketball play, the kind that happens 100 times a night, in every arena, in every game. Reggie Theus of the Kansas City Kings rose up for a dunk. Bernard King did what any great competitor does. He planted his right leg under the hoop and went up to block it. And in that instant, at the very peak of his powers, everything came apart. The damage was as catastrophic as the basketball world had seen. A torn anterior cruciate ligament, a torn meniscus, and a lateral condyle fracture of the femur, a break in the bone of the upper leg. 3 serious injuries, all in the same knee, all at once. This wasn't a sprain or a strain that costs a man a few weeks. This was the kind of wreckage that required major reconstruction, the kind of injury that, in that era, ended careers and didn't ask permission. Think about the timing, because the cruelty of it is almost too much. This wasn't a fading veteran getting hurt on the back end of his run. This was the reigning scoring champion of the entire league. The man Dr. J had just named the toughest he'd ever faced. He was operating at a level almost no one in the sport could touch. And on one ordinary defensive play, all of it stopped. The cost was staggering. He would miss the entire 1985 to 86 season. An entire year gone, erased from the prime of a career that had taken so much pain to build in the first place. And remember what it had cost him to even get here. The arrests, the collapse in Utah, the fight to reclaim his life before he could reclaim his game. He had clawed all the way back to the very top, and now his own body had betrayed him at the summit. In 1985, no player in league history had ever come back to true form from an injury this severe. The medical reality was brutal, and the precedent was non-existent. As far as most of the basketball world was concerned, his story was over. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. Here is the fact that defined the odds against him. Up to that point, no player in the history of the sport had returned to form after an injury that severe, surgery that extensive, and that much lost time. There was no blueprint, no comeback to study, no veteran to call who'd walked the same road and made it back. He was being asked to do something no one before him had done. And the way Bernard chose to do it tells you everything about the man. He disappeared, not in defeat, in determination. He rehabilitated completely out of the media spotlight, away from the cameras and the questions and the doubters. There were no triumphant updates, no staged footage of a star fighting his way back for the public to cheer along with. There was just a man, alone with his ruined knee, driving himself back into competitive shape one painful day at a time. And if that pattern sounds familiar, it should, because this is the exact same discipline that had already saved his life once before. Years earlier, the quiet, private work in that California center and those recovery rooms had pulled him back from a different kind of edge. Now that same engine, the refusal to be finished, the willingness to do the brutal, unglamorous work where no one was watching, was pointed at a shattered leg instead of an addiction. The fight had changed. The fighter hadn't. That's the thread running through this whole story. Bernard King's greatness was never just in the highlights. It lived in the parts nobody saw. The hours in the rooms, the hours in the rehab, the private war a man wages with himself when the easy thing, the expected thing, would be to simply accept the verdict and walk away. Twice now, the world had counted him out. Twice, he answered in silence and let the results speak when he was ready. When he finally returned, he scored at an elite clip again. But the Knicks made a decision that stunned everyone who had watched him fight his way back. When Bernard King finally walked back onto an NBA floor, the question hanging over him was simple and merciless. Was the scorer still in there? After everything, the reconstruction, the lost season, the injury no one had ever truly recovered from, could the man still put the ball in the basket the way he once had? The early answer was yes. Across his first 6 games back, he averaged 22.7 points per game. 22.7 from a man whose knee had been torn apart and rebuilt, who had spent an entire year away from competition. By any reasonable measure, that's not just a return. That's a return at an elite level. The instinct, the touch, the relentless will to score, all of it was still alive in there. But there was a harder truth underneath those numbers, and it's the part that hurts. He had not gotten back his pre-injury explosiveness. The points were still coming, but that violent, sudden burst, the thing that had made him impossible to guard, the thing that had carried him to a scoring title and 60 on Christmas, was no longer quite the same. He could still score, he just couldn't fly the way he once had. And so, the franchise made its call. At the end of the 1987 season, the New York Knicks released him. Read that and let the weight of it land. This was the team he'd come home to, the team in the city that made him on the cracked courts of his boyhood. The man who had dropped 50 in back-to-back nights in Texas, who had electrified the most famous arena in the sport, who had fought his way back from an injury no one had ever beaten, and the answer he got was the door. The Brooklyn Sun who had given that building some of its greatest nights was let go. You can imagine how final that felt. A serious accusation had once threatened to take his freedom. An addiction had nearly taken his life. A knee injury had nearly taken his career. And now the franchise he loved was telling him, in the coldest language a league knows, that they thought he was finished. Most players would have accepted that as the end. But Bernard King had already saved himself once before, and he was about to prove the doubters wrong all over again, in Washington. When the door closed in New York, most of the basketball world assumed it was closing on the whole story. A reconstructed knee, a lost season, an explosiveness that hadn't fully returned, and now a release. The math seemed simple. The journey was over. The Washington Bullets saw it differently. They took a chance on a man the league had written off, and in doing so, they handed Bernard King the stage for the most improbable chapter of his entire career. Because understand what was being attempted here. This wasn't a comeback from one disaster. It was a comeback from two. He had already climbed out of the darkest stretch of his life once before, rebuilding himself from the addiction he later admitted had nearly swallowed everything. Now, years later, he was being asked to climb out of a second catastrophe, a devastating injury to that right knee that no player before him had ever truly conquered. Most athletes never face a moment like that even once. Bernard faced it twice, and in Washington, he answered it again. He rebuilt his game piece by piece on that floor, defying the verdict the Knicks had handed him at the end of the 1987 season.
The scorer who supposedly couldn't fly anymore found other ways to put the ball in the basket. The footwork, the angles, the relentless will that had carried him since the Brooklyn playgrounds. The explosiveness may have changed, but the hunger never did, and the production followed. The man everyone had counted out proved on a new team in a new city that he could still be a high-level threat in the toughest league in the world. Think about what that takes. Not the talent. He'd always had that. The mental fortitude. The refusal to accept someone else's conclusion about when you're finished. In Washington, he wasn't a former star riding out the end of a career. He was a man making a statement, night after night, to every front office that had decided he was done. His past legal troubles had not disappeared. His addiction had nearly ended his career. His knee injury had taken away the player he once was. And yet, on the court, he still found a way back. And neither had the release. This was vindication, plain and simple. A journey from being shown the door to standing tall as one of the most respected scorers in the game all over again. His Washington years would carry him toward a recognition that, given everything he'd survived, once seemed impossible. A place among the immortals of the game. There is an honor in this sport reserved for the very few. Enshrinement in the Hall of Fame. The permanent record of greatness. The company of legends. The final word on a career. And in time, that honor came to Bernard King. On the surface, the case writes itself. A scoring title at 32.9 a night. Back-to-back selections to the All-NBA First Team, 2,027 points in a single season, 60 points on Christmas Day, placing him among the rarest scorers the league had ever produced, 50 in back-to-back nights in Texas, the first man to do it in 17 years. By the cold logic of the numbers alone, he belonged. But the numbers tell only half of why this honor matters so much in his case.
Because this was a career that nearly ended not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. It nearly ended in a Salt Lake City courtroom where a serious accusation once threatened a decade of his freedom. It nearly ended in the grip of an addiction he would later describe in the bleakest possible terms, the season he collapsed to just 19 games. And it nearly ended on a single ordinary defensive play when his right knee came apart at the very summit of the game. So when you put that Hall of Fame plaque in its true context, it stops being only a tribute to scoring. It becomes a monument to survival, to the sobriety he fought for in those quiet rooms, to the silent rehabilitation he drove himself through with no blueprint to follow, to a refusal to quit that defined him long before any award ever did. This is where the whole arc finally resolves. The man had 2 wars to wage. One was for his legacy on the floor, the titles, the records, the respect of legends like Dr. J. The other was for his life itself, against the bottle, against the body that betrayed him, against the league that kept deciding he was finished. He won both. Most people never win either. He won the one nobody could see first, and then he won the one the whole world could. That plaque doesn't just say he was great. It says he was unbreakable. But to understand why his story matters so much more than the trophies, we have to look at the man he became after the buzzer stopped sounding. For decades, the world had only the outline, the arrest reports, the dropped charges, the collapse in Utah, the injury, the comebacks. But the inside of the story, the why beneath all of it, stayed locked away until he chose to open it himself. In his 2017 autobiography, Bernard looked back across all of it with the kind of honesty that takes a lifetime to earn. He didn't hide from the late 1970s. He named the addiction that had hunted him through those years. He owned the stretch he called the darkest period of his life. And in doing so, he gave the public something the box scores never could: the truth of what nearly destroyed him, told in his own words. That confession reframes everything. Because the easy story is to look at a gifted young athlete piling up arrests and call it arrogance or recklessness or a man simply throwing away his blessings. The harder, truer story is the one he tells: a man drowning, a talent loud enough to fill arenas while something quieter pulled him under one night at a time. The self-sabotage wasn't a character flaw to be sneered at. It was a sickness, and beating it required more courage than any 50-point night ever did. And the timeline he leaves behind is its own kind of testimony. The early 1980 arrest, the month at that California center, the recovery rooms that followed. The comeback that turned a man given up for finished into the comeback player of the year, and then into the best scorer alive. Line those moments up and you see something rare. A star who was forced to confront his demons not in private, but in public, with his name in the headlines and his future hanging by a thread. That's what makes him both at once: a cautionary tale and a redemption story, living in the same man. The warning is real. Talent alone saves no one, and the bottom is closer than any young star wants to believe. But so is the hope, because he proved that no matter how far gone a person seems, the road back exists for the one willing to walk it sober, one day at a time. When you line up every date, every arrest, every injury, and every comeback side by side, one final question remains. What is the true legacy of Bernard King? So let's stand back and take in the whole of it. A boy on the cracked outdoor courts of Fort Hamilton, learning to disappear into a basketball. One half of the Ernie and Bernie Show, the golden age they still talk about in Tennessee. A top 10 pick whose private life cracked open a month later. A rookie who set a franchise scoring record while the law kept finding him in the worst possible places. A man who merely lost his freedom in Salt Lake City, who collapsed to just 19 games. who admitted years later that the bottle had nearly taken everything. And then the turn, the California Center, the recovery rooms, the comeback player of the year, 60 points on Christmas Day, a scoring title at 32.9 a night, the toughest man Dr. J ever faced, a shattered knee that should have ended him, a silent rehabilitation with no blueprint to follow, a resurrection in Washington, and finally, a plaque in the Hall of Fame. You cannot separate the two halves of that story, and that's the whole point. The greatness on the floor is inseparable from the battle off it. The same engine that drove him back from addiction drove him back from a leg that came apart at the summit of the sport.
The same refusal to accept defeat that put 50 in back-to-back nights also put him through the quiet, unglamorous war that saved his life. He was a scoring genius, yes, but before he could ever become a legend, he had to do the hardest thing a gifted man can do. He had to save himself first. That's why his name still carries weight with those of us who watched it unfold. Not just because of what he did to defenders, because of what he survived to do it. So now it comes to you. When you weigh the talent against the trouble, the arrests against the comebacks, the darkest period against the highest summit, what do you make of Bernard King?
Is he the cautionary tale, the redemption story, or the rare man who managed to be both and still walk out the other side with his name among the immortals? Sit with that question. Talk it over. Because a life like his isn't meant to be filed away with a single easy answer. It's meant to be remembered, argued over, and respected for everything it took to live.